The auction ring on the slaver moon of Heshkaru went quiet the moment the dead ship spoke its own name back to the men who had killed it. You should understand what that meant to the ones standing there. You are one of them. You have spent your life inside the Voral Reach, where the Skarn Dominion runs everything that matters, and the Skarn Dominion is built on a single idea. The strong take, the weak are taken, whole peoples are caught, counted, sorted, and sold, and nobody ever comes back from the ledger to argue the math. The ledger is the law. You were taught that before you could walk. You keep that ledger. That is your work, and it has been your work for 40 years. Your name is Orental, and you are a sorter of cargo for the Skarn Dominion, which is a soft way of saying you decide what a captured person is worth, and you write it down. You are good at it. You are old at it. You have a slow eye and a steady hand, and you do not flinch, and in the trade of taking people, that is considered a virtue. You have sorted more than 200,000 living souls across 40 years, and you have never once let your hand shake while you did it. That is the kind of person you are. Remember that, because it is going to matter. This story begins on an ordinary day, by the standards of the trade. A raider squadron of the Skarn Dominion had come back from the deep dark with a fresh catch, and the catch was being walked off the transports in long gray lines, and you were at your high desk above the auction ring with your stylus warm in your hand. Below you, the floor was loud, buyers shouting, chains dragging, the auctioneer working the crowd. The smell of too many frightened bodies in too small a space. You had sorted 41 lots already that morning. You were tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. You had a system, the way every old sorter has a system. You looked at the body first, then the eyes, then the hands. The body told you the species and the price band. The eyes told you whether the catch had broken yet, because a broken catch sells low, and a defiant one sells high, to the kind of buyer who likes to do the breaking himself. The hands told you the trade, whether this was a digger, or a builder, or a grower, or a soft house servant, and the trade set the final number. Body, eyes, hands. 40 years. You could sort a soul in the time it took to breathe twice, and you were proud of that. In the small, cold way a man is proud of a thing he should be ashamed of. You want to know how a person becomes the thing you are. It is not one choice. That is the trick of it. No one ever stands at a high desk and decides, today I will become a man who prices children. It happens the way water shapes stone, one small flat day at a time. The first lot you ever sorted, 40 years gone, you were sick for 3 days afterward. The 100th, you slept fine. The 1000th, you had a system. By the 100,000th you had stopped seeing faces at all. You saw only the body, the eyes, the hands, and you told yourself this was professionalism, and the Dominion agreed with you and paid you well, and a thing the whole world agrees with you about stops feeling like a sin and starts feeling like the weather. That is how it is done. That is how you do a terrible thing for 40 years and keep a steady hand. You let the world tell you it is not terrible, and you believe the world, because believing the world is easier than believing your own first 3 sick days. The Dominion has a word for what you do. It calls it stewardship. It teaches the young sorters that the trade is a kindness, that the taken are better off counted and fed and useful than left to die free on some backward world, that the ledger is a mercy because it keeps track, because a number is at least remembered while a free life is forgotten. You believed that too, for a while, in the middle years, when believing it let you sleep. You stopped believing it a long time ago, but you kept doing the work, because by then the work was the only thing you knew how to do, and a man does not unmake 40 years of himself just because he has stopped believing the story that built him. He keeps going. He keeps his hand steady. He tells the new young sorters the kindness story and watches their faces do what his face did, and he hates himself in a small flat way that never grows loud enough to stop him. Then the lights changed. They did not flicker. They did not fail. They dimmed, all at once, every lamp across the whole auction moon, dropping to a low red, as if some great hand had reached into the power and turned it down by a careful, exact amount. The shouting stopped. The chains stopped. 2,000 buyers and sellers and sorters and guards all went still at the same moment, and in that stillness, A sound came down through the rock of the moon and into the floor under your feet. It was a voice. It was not loud. That was the worst part. It was a calm, flat voice speaking in the trade tongue of the Skarn Dominion, and it was speaking from somewhere above the moon, from somewhere in the dark where there was supposed to be nothing but your own patrol ships, and it said a single sentence. It said, "This is the Sable Wake, and it has come back for its people." You did not know that name. Almost nobody in that room knew that name, but 3 of the old raid captains in the front row did, and you watched the color leave their faces in real time, and that is when you began to be afraid. Let me tell you what the Sable Wake was, because you would only learn it later, in pieces, from records that were supposed to have been burned. 11 years before that morning, the Skarn Dominion had found a small human convoy at the edge of the Reach. Humanity was new to your part of the dark then. A young people, a quiet people, a people who built well and kept to themselves and had not yet learned what kind of neighbors they had. The convoy was 4 colony haulers and 1 escort. The escort was a warship called the Sable Wake, and it was 900 meters of dark, seamless hull, and the raid captains of the Dominion looked at 1 human warship guarding 4 soft, fat haulers, and they saw an easy day. It was not an easy day. The Sable Wake fought for 11 hours against 30 raider ships, and it broke 19 of them before they could break it, and when it finally went dark it took 2 of their heaviest with it in the same instant. The Dominion lost more ships at that one convoy than it had lost in the previous 9 years combined. The records of that fight were sealed afterward, because the Dominion does not like to keep accounts of days that cost it 19 ships, but you have read them now, and the numbers are these. The first raider died 11 minutes into the engagement. The Sable Wake took no losses of its own for the first 6 hours. By the time it fell, it was venting from 40 wounds and trailing its own hull in a long dark ribbon, and it was still firing, and it was still placing its shots so precisely that even broken and dying it killed 2 more ships in the last 60 seconds than it had killed in the previous hour. And here is the thing, the sealed records show that the Dominion would most like to forget. The Sable Wake spent the last hour of that fight not trying to win. It could not win. 30 against 1 and 19 already dead, and the haulers were already lost, and any Skarn captain in that position would have run for the dark to save his own hull. The Sable Wake did not run. It spent its last hour placing itself between the raiders and the haulers, not to save them, it could not save them, but to slow the taking, to buy minutes, because every minute it bought was a minute its 400,000 people were still free, and a human ship, the records show, will spend itself entirely to buy the people behind it 1 more minute of not being chained. It did not fight to win, it fought to make the taking cost something, and it made the taking cost 19 ships, and that was the most expensive easy day the Skarn Dominion ever had. And in the end the haulers were taken anyway, because there were only so many hours in a fight, and only 1 ship to fight them, and 400,000 humans were dragged into the ledger and scattered across the Reach to be sold. The Sable Wake itself was logged as destroyed. Its broken hull was towed to the Dominion's ship graveyard, a cold drifting field of 9,000 dead warships where the Dominion stacks its kills like trophies, and it was left there to rot among the bones of everything else it had ever beaten. That was 11 years ago. That was supposed to be the end of it. The men who took that convoy were given medals. The captain who logged the kill, a Skarn warlord named Drevenskar, was promoted for it. He was in the front row that morning. You were close enough to see him stand up out of his chair when the dead ship said its name, and you saw that his hand went to the medal he still wore on his chest, the medal he had been given for killing a ship that was, at that exact moment, hanging over his head and saying it had come back. You did not know any of this yet. All you knew, standing at your high desk with your stylus going still in your hand, was that the lights had gone red, and a calm voice was speaking out of a grave, and the 3 hardest men in the room looked like they had seen the dead walk. The voice spoke again. It said, 11 years ago you took 400,000 of mine. I have spent 11 years finding every one of them. I know where each of them is. I have come to take them home. And then it told the room exactly how long the room had to decide what kind of day this was going to be. It said, You have 1 hour. An hour is a strange thing to give people who deal in the taking of lives. It is mercy, and it is also a kind of cruelty, because an hour is just long enough for everyone to understand exactly how much trouble they are in. You stood at your high desk, and you watched the auction ring come apart in slow stages. First the buyers, who were not fighters, who had only come to spend money. They began to move toward the doors, quietly at first, then faster, then not quietly at all. Then the lesser guards, the ones with no rank to lose, drifting toward the launch bays where the small ships were. Only the raid captains stayed still, and they stayed still the way a person stays still when running would not help, when there is nowhere in the whole dark that running would help. You watched one buyer, a fat trader you had sold to 100 times, try to drag 3 chained souls out the door with him, because even now, even with a grave hanging over the moon, he could not stand to leave money on the floor. A guard stopped him, not out of mercy. The guard stopped him because the voice had said, "Leave my people where they are," and the guard had decided that the voice was not a thing to disobey. The trader let go of the chains and ran without them, and that was the first time in your 40 years you ever saw a Scarn man choose his life over his profit, and you understood that the whole moon had already changed and the hour was barely begun. The warlord Drevenskar walked up the stairs to your desk. You did not invite him. He came anyway, because he wanted height, because he wanted to see the sky, and your desk had the only window in the auction hall that looked up. Through that window, you saw it for the first time. It was hanging above the moon. It had not announced its arrival with engines or fire. It was simply there, the way a mountain is there when the fog lifts, a long dark shape against the stars, 900 meters of seamless hull with no lights on it anywhere. No running lamps, no banners, no painted name. It did not glow and it did not pulse, and it made no sound that reached the ground, and somehow that was worse than any amount of glowing and pulsing would have been. It looked patient. It looked like it had all the time that had ever existed. You looked for the wounds. You had read the sealed records by then, in your head if not yet on a slate, and you knew the sable wake had fallen venting from 40 wounds, with its hull trailing in a ribbon behind it. There were no wounds. The hull was seamless and whole and dark, and you understood that whatever had happened to it in 11 years in the graveyard, it had not been left to rot. It had healed. A ship does not heal. A ship is repaired by hands. And there were no hands in the graveyard, no docks, no yards, nothing but 9,000 dead trophies and the cold. And yet the wounds were gone, and that meant the hands had been inside the whole time, working, for 11 years, in the dark, with nobody watching. Drevenskar looked at it for a long moment. Then he said a thing you did not expect. He said, "I knew it was not dead." You asked him what he meant. He told you. He had been the one who logged the kill, 11 years ago, and he had stood on the bridge of the tow ship that dragged the broken sable wake into the graveyard, and he had looked at the dead hull through the same kind of window you were looking through now, and something about it had bothered him for 11 years. The hull was broken, the power was gone, 19 of his ships were scattered across the convoy as wreckage, and 2 of his heaviest had died with it. By every measure it was a corpse, but its hull had not gone cold the way dead hulls go cold. It had cooled to a certain temperature, and then it had stopped cooling, and it had held that temperature all the way to the graveyard, and he had not been able to explain it, and he had not put it in the log, because a man does not get promoted for kills he is not sure of. You did not understand then why a temperature would frighten a warlord. You understand now. A corpse cools to the temperature of the dark around it because there is nothing left inside to keep it warm. A thing that cools partway and then stops is a thing that decided how warm to be. It is a thing that is keeping something alive. The sable wake had not been dead in the graveyard. It had been resting. Drevenskar told you something else, then, quietly, the way a man tells a thing he has never said aloud. He said that in the years after the kill, he had gone back to the graveyard 3 times. Not on orders, on his own. He had taken a small ship out to the cold field of 9,000 dead hulls, and he had found the sable wake among them, and he had sat in the dark beside it and looked at it, and each time he went, it was a little less broken than the time before. The first time, the ribbon of hull was still trailing. The second time, 2 years later, the ribbon was gone and the wounds were closed over. The third time, the hull was whole and dark and seamless, and Drevenskar had sat there beside it in his small ship for a long time, and then he had turned around and flown home and never gone back, because he had understood, sitting in the cold, that the thing was healing, and a man who understands that the thing he killed is healing has two choices. He can tell someone, or he can pretend he saw nothing. Drevenskar pretended. For 9 years he pretended, and now the thing was over his head saying it had come back, and his pretending was over. You asked him why he had pretended. It was a foolish question to ask a warlord, but the moon was ending and foolishness felt allowed. And he gave you an honest answer, which surprised you, because Drevenskar was not an honest man. He said, because if I told them it was healing, they would have sent a fleet to finish it. And I sat beside it 3 times in the cold, and I will tell you a thing I have never told anyone. I did not want them to finish it. I do not know why. I had killed it once and been given a medal, and some part of me, the part I do not look at, did not want it killed twice. So I said nothing, and I let it heal, and I told myself I was a coward, and maybe I was. Or maybe, he said, looking up at the dark whole hull through the window, maybe some animal part of me knew that a thing which heals itself for 11 years in a graveyard with no hands is a thing you should not finish, because it is not finishing it that will save your moon when it comes back. He laughed, then a short, ugly laugh, and he said, and look, here it is, and it is giving us an hour, which is more than I ever gave anyone. Below you the auction ring had nearly emptied of buyers. The gray lines of the catch, the captured people who had been walked off the transports that morning, were still standing in their chains where they had been left, because nobody had thought to do anything with them, because everyone with a key was busy trying to leave. You looked at them, 40 years of sorting cargo, and you had never once really looked. They looked back up at the dark shape in the window with an expression you did not have a word for. It was not hope. Hope is a soft thing. This was harder than hope. This was the face of someone who has heard a promise kept. The hour was 40 minutes gone when the first raid captain decided to fight. His name does not matter. He was young and proud, and he had 11 gunboats under his command parked in the moon's near orbit, and he could not stand the idea of one ship telling the whole Dominion what to do, and so he gave the order, and his 11 gunboats turned and lit their guns and fired everything they had at the dark, patient shape above the moon. You saw it happen through the window. 11 streams of fire crossing the short distance, more firepower than it takes to crack a city, all of it converging on a single point. It did not reach the hull. The fire stopped. Not exploded, not deflected, stopped. Every round and every beam going dark, and still 100 meters short of the sable wake, hanging in the empty dark like sparks frozen in glass. For one full breath, the whole barrage simply hung there, 11 gunboats worth of death, holding still in the space between the ships. And then it began to drift back the way it had come, slowly, gently, each round and each beam turning around and floating home, and the gunboats that had fired them watched their own fire come back to them across the dark. The sable wake did not destroy the gunboats. That is the thing you have to understand any of this. It gave them their fire back. It returned exactly what was sent, no more, at exactly the speed it could be dodged, and it spoke to them on every channel at once while it did it, and what it said was, "That was yours. I am giving it back. Do not make me hold it for you again." 10 of the 11 captains understood the offer. They cut their power and they drifted, and they let their own returned fire pass them by, and they lived. One did not. One captain pushed his ship into the path of his own returned barrage out of pride, because he would rather break than be spared, and his gunboat came apart in a silent flower of light, and the 10 who lived watched it happen and learned the lesson the hard way, which is the only way the proud ever learn anything. The sable wake said one more thing to the 10 survivors. It said, "You have not taken any of mine. Go home. This is not your debt." And they went. 10 gunboats turning and running for the dark, and not one of them looked back, and the sable wake let every single one of them go. That was when you began to understand what kind of thing was hanging over the moon. It was not a thing that had come to kill everyone. If it had wanted everyone dead, the buyers would have died at the doors, the guards would have died in the launch bays, the 10 proud captains would have died with the 11th. It had let all of them go. It was sorting. It was going through the whole moon the way you go through a catch, deciding who owed what, and it was settling only the debts that were owed to it, and it was leaving everything else alone. It was doing your job. It was doing your exact job, the sorting and the counting, and the careful flat decision of what each life was worth. And it was doing it to you. Except it was doing your job the way it should always have been done, with the truth instead of the price. And that was the difference. And the difference was going to find you before the hour was out. You watched the returned fire drift past the 10 surviving gunboats and out into the empty dark, and you understood something that turned your stomach cold. The sable wake had not just stopped the barrage. It had caught 11 gunboats worth of fire, every round and every beam, sorted out which captain had fired which, and sent each captain his own fire back and no one else's. That is not a defense. A defense stops everything in a wall. This was bookkeeping. This was a ship that, in the half-second the fire crossed the dark, had opened a ledger and matched every round to its owner and returned each debt to the one who owed it, precisely, and you, a sorter of 40 years, recognized the work, because it was your work, done faster and cleaner than you could do it, by a thing that had decided to use the trade's own cold arithmetic against the trade. It frightened you more than any gun could have. A gun only kills. This thing counted. Drevenskar saw this too. He was a warlord, and he was a killer, but he was not a stupid man, and he understood before you did what the calm and the patience and the returned fire really meant. He turned away from the window, and he started down the stairs, and you asked him where he was going, and he said the only true thing he said all day. He said, "It has not come for the moon. It has come for me. The rest of you are just standing too close." He was right. But he was also wrong about one part, and the part he was wrong about is the part this whole story turns on, and it is this. He thought standing close to him was an accident. He thought you were innocent. He thought the dead ship would settle his debt and the debts of the men who had taken the convoy, and that everyone else, the buyers and the guards and the sorters, would walk away clean. You knew better. You stood at your high desk and you looked down at the 41 lots you had sorted that morning, the 41 careful entries in your ledger, each one a living person reduced to a number and a price, and you knew that the dead ship over the moon was going to read that ledger. You knew because it had said it knew where every one of its 400,000 people was, and the only way to know that is to read every ledger that ever recorded them, and your ledger was full of names. You had 31 minutes left when you understood that the sable wake had not come only for the men who pulled the triggers 11 years ago. It had come for everyone who had written a number next to a stolen life and called it cargo. It had come for the keepers of the ledger. It had come for you. You looked at your hands. They were not shaking. 40 years of practice, and even now they were not shaking, and you hated them for it. You wanted them to shake. You wanted, for the first time in your life, to be the kind of person whose hands shook when they did a terrible thing, because a person like that might be forgiven, and you understood with a cold falling certainty that you had never once been that kind of person. You had been worse than the men who pulled the triggers. The men who pulled the triggers did it in 11 hours of fear and fury. You had done it slowly, calmly, every day for 40 years, with a steady hand and a slow eye, and you had called it a virtue. The voice came down through the rock again. It was not speaking to the room this time. It was speaking to a coordinate, to a single point, and the point was your desk, and it said your name. It said, Oren Tall, sorter. You have written 406 of my people into your book, across 11 years. Bring the book to the ring. The whole emptying hall heard it. Drevenskar, halfway down the stairs, stopped, and turned, and looked back up at you with an expression that was almost pity, the pity of one condemned man for another, and he said, I told you. You stood too close. And you picked up your ledger, the heavy old data slate with 406 of the Sable Wake's people written into it, among the 200,000 others, and you carried it down the stairs into the empty auction ring, because there was nothing else in the whole dark that you could do. The auction ring was the largest open space on the moon, a great stone bowl with the high desks around the rim and the selling block in the center, and it was almost empty now. The buyers were gone. Most of the guards were gone. What was left was the captured catch in their long gray chained lines, perhaps 800 souls who had been walked off the transports that morning and never claimed, and a scatter of raid captains who had nowhere left to run, and you, walking down the steps with your ledger held against your chest like a child holds a thing it loves. You reached the selling block. You did not know what you were supposed to do, so you set the ledger down on the block where 10,000 stolen people had been set down before it, and you waited. The Sable Wake spoke to you. It did not speak through the rock now. It spoke through a small, clear voice that seemed to come from the air a step in front of you, the way a person speaks who is standing close, and it asked you a question. It asked, "Did you write these names yourself?" You said yes. It asked, "Did you know they were people when you wrote them?" You wanted very badly to say no. You wanted to say you thought of them as cargo, as numbers, as lots, that you had never once let yourself see the people behind the numbers, and that this had made you innocent, the way a tool is innocent. But you had carried that ledger down the stairs, and you had set it on the block, and you were too old and too tired to lie to a thing that had crossed 11 years of dark to ask you one honest question. You said yes. You said, "I knew. I always knew. I wrote them anyway." There was a silence then. It was not a long silence, but it was a complete one, and in it you understood that you had just signed something, that you had refused the one door that might have let you out, and you found that you did not regret it. 40 years of not letting your hands shake, and the first true thing you ever did was to refuse to be a tool. The Sable Wake said, "Then you understand the ledger better than anyone alive on this moon. I am going to need it, and I am going to need you. You did not understand. You said so. It told you. And as it told you, you began to understand what it had been doing for 11 years in the cold of the graveyard, and why it had let the buyers go, and the guards, and the 10 proud captains, and why it had come for the keepers of the book before it came for the men who pulled the triggers. It said, when you take a person and write them into a book, you think you have erased them. You think the number replaces the name, but every ledger is a map, every sale is a thread. You wrote 406 of my people into this slate, and from this slate I can read where they were sent, and from where they were sent I can read who bought them, and from who bought them I can read where they are now. You did not bury my people, Sorter. You drew me a map to every single one of them, and you have been keeping it up to date for 11 years. You looked at the ledger on the block, 406 names, and behind those 406, the threads running out to the buyers, and behind the buyers, the threads running to the moons and the stations, and the mining hulks where the catch ends up, and behind those the rest of the 400,000, scattered across the whole reach, every one of them written into some ledger somewhere by some sorter exactly like you. The Sable Wake had not spent 11 years building a bigger gun. It had spent 11 years reading. It told you how it had done it, and you have never heard anything that frightened you more in your life, because it was so patient, and so quiet, and so completely without rage. It told you that for the first 2 years it could do nothing but heal. The hull was open to the dark, and the core was nearly cold, and the 400 minds inside slept, while the ship knit itself back together one seam at a time from the wreckage of the other ships in the graveyard, because the graveyard was full of metal, and the ship took what it needed from the dead trophies around it. Slowly, so slowly that no patrol ever noticed a corpse field rearranging itself by a hand's width a year. It built itself back from the bones of the ships that had once been its enemies. It wore its enemies like new skin. In the 3rd year it woke enough to listen. It did not move and it did not speak. It only listened, opening one thin thread into the data streams of the Dominion, and it learned the trade tongue, and it learned the trade, and it learned the shape of the great machine that takes people and turns them into numbers. And then, for 8 more years, it read every ledger, every sale log, every keeper's book it could reach through the streams, and the ones it could not reach it noted and set aside, because some books are sealed and kept apart, like yours. It read 2 billion entries across 8 years. Somewhere in those 2 billion were 400,000 of its people, scattered and renamed and resold and moved, and it found them, one thread at a time, the way you pull one hair out of a tangled mass without breaking the rest, and it built a map, and it checked the map, and it rechecked it until it knew. That was the 11 years. Not vengeance hot and fast, vengeance slow and exact, vengeance that did its homework, vengeance that read the books until it had read every book in the reach except the sealed ones, and then it came to the moon where the keepers were, to ask the keepers for the last few books by hand. You ask it how it had read your sealed master book, if your book was kept apart from the streams, and the answer told you the last thing you needed to know about the patience of the thing over your head. It said, "I did not read your book. I could not. That is why I came to this moon in person and asked you for it by hand, and that is why I gave the moon an hour, because an hour was how long it would take you to walk down the stairs and decide. Everything I did on this moon, the dimmed lights, the returned fire, the hour, all of it was arranged around a single point, which was you, sorter, and the choice you would make about a sealed book that I could not take and would not take, only ask for. You think the hour was for the buyers to run and the captains to fight. It was not. The hour was for you. I have known for 8 years that the last gap in my map was the sealed master book of HFY, and I have known for 8 years that the only way to close it was to find the keeper who held it and ask him to open his hand. I did not come to this moon to punish keepers. I came to this moon to find the one keeper who would say yes, and to give him the chance to. You were the reason. You were always the reason. You just did not know it until now. You stood very still when it said that. Because it meant the whole of it, the 11 years and the healing in the cold, and the reading of 2 billion entries, and the crossing of the dark, all of it had narrowed down, at the end, to whether one old scarn sorter would carry a slate down a flight of stairs and choose to unseal it. The Sable Wake had built its entire campaign on a bet that somewhere in the machine that takes people there was one keeper left who would, given an hour and an honest question, open his hand. It had bet 400,000 people on the existence of one decent choice in one tired old man, and it had won the bet. You won the bet for it. And you understood, standing there, that this was the most anyone had ever trusted you with, and that you had nearly not been the man worth trusting, and that the distance between the man who would have closed the book and the man who opened it was 1 hour, one single hour, the hour that humanity had crossed 11 years of cold to give you. It told you about the hardest threads, the ones it had nearly lost. It told you of a girl, 11 years old when she was taken, who had been sold and resold 9 times across 8 years, each sale renaming her, each ledger recording a different number, so that following her was like following one drop of water through 9 rivers. The Sable Wake had spent 4 months of its 8 reading years on that one girl, cross-checking 9 ledgers kept by 9 keepers on 9 moons, matching the small details that survive a renaming, the species, the age at first sale, the small note one careless keeper had made about a scar, until it was certain, until it knew that the lot numbered differently in 9 books was one girl, and where she was now, and that she was alive. 4 months. For one child. And it had done that, it told you, 400,000 times. Because there was no other way, because the trade had scattered its people on purpose to make them unfollowable, and the only answer to a deliberate scattering is a patience deeper than the cruelty that made it. You understood, listening, that the trade had built a maze precisely so that no one could ever walk back through it to find one stolen child, and humanity had simply sat down in the cold and walked back through the whole maze 400,000 times and not given up on a single thread. It told you, too, about the 400 who had stayed awake to do the reading, because not all 400 slept the whole 11 years. They had taken turns. 200 slept while 200 read, and then they traded, year by year, so that no one mind would have to carry the whole 11 years of it, because to read 2 billion ledger entries looking for the people you love is a thing that can break a mind, and they knew it, and they had built the watch turns to share the breaking out among 400 so that no one would have to carry it alone. That, you thought, was the most human thing of all. Not that they could endure the cold. Anything can be made to endure the cold, but that they had thought in advance about how to keep each other whole through it, that they had divided the suffering on purpose so that it would be survivable, that even in a broken hull in a graveyard, with 11 years of grief ahead of them, their first thought had been, how do we keep each other from breaking? The Dominion would never have thought of that. The Dominion does not divide its suffering. The Dominion makes one body carry all of it and calls the body weak when it breaks. You asked it the question that mattered. You asked what happens to the buyers. The ones who hold your people now, what happens to them when you find them? The Sable Wake answered, and its answer is the reason this is a story about vengeance and not a story about slaughter, and you should listen to it carefully because the difference is the whole of everything. It said, I am going to take my people back. From every moon and every station and every hulk where they were sent, I am going to take them back. The ones who hold them will be given the same hour I gave this moon. Those who open their hands and let my people walk out will keep their lives and their ships and their stations, and I will leave them exactly as I found them, because they are not my debt, they are only standing close to it. Those who close their fists and try to keep what they stole will have it taken from them, and only what they stole, and nothing more. I do not burn worlds, Sorter. I am not the Dominion. I take back what is mine, and I leave everything else alone. That is the whole of it. You understood then why 11 years. A burning would have taken an afternoon. A burning is easy. You point the guns at the moons, and you pull the triggers, and the holders die, and your people die with them, because your people are on those moons, and the burning does not sort the guilty from the held. The Sable Wake could not burn. Its people were inside everything it wanted to destroy. So it could not be fast and it could not be hot. It had to be slow and exact and patient. It had to read every book and learn every thread and know precisely who held what, so that it could take back its people one careful extraction at a time without killing a single one of them in the taking. The vengeance was not the burning. The vengeance was the precision. The vengeance was being so exact that the guilty had nowhere to hide in the crowd, and the innocent had nothing to fear, and there is no harder thing in the whole dark than that, and the Dominion had never once managed it in 9,000 years of taking. Your Dominion had always solved every problem the same way, with fire, because fire is fast, and fire does not require you to know anything about the people you are burning. Humanity had looked at the same problem and refused the fire, and had paid for that refusal with 11 years in the cold, because the only way to be both certain and clean is to be slow, and the only way to be slow is to be patient, and the only thing in the universe more patient than a Dominion that has waited 9,000 years to take is a people who have decided to wait 11 years to give back. You said a thing then that surprised you, because it came up out of 40 years and you had never let it up before. You said, the Dominion would call your way weakness. 11 years to do what fire does in an afternoon. They would say a strong people burns and goes home, and only a weak people sits in the cold reading books. And the Sable Wake answered, and you have kept the answer like a stone in your hand ever since. It said, the Dominion is right that fire is faster. The Dominion is wrong about which thing is harder. Anyone can burn. A child can burn. Burning is what you do when you cannot tell the guilty from the held, and you have decided to stop caring about the difference. It takes nothing. It costs nothing but the lives you have stopped counting. The hard thing, Sorter, the strong thing, is to care about the difference so much that you will spend 11 years in the cold rather than let one of your own people die in your own fire. That is not weakness. That is the most expensive strength there is. The Dominion cannot afford it. That is why the Dominion burns. Not because it is strong, because it is too poor in patience to be anything else. The Sable Wake said, I have read every ledger in the Reach, but the Keeper's books are kept apart and sealed, and yours is the master book of this moon. With it I close the last gaps. Will you give it to me freely? You looked at the 800 chained souls around the ring. You looked at the 406 names on the block. You looked at your own steady hands, the hands that had never shaken, and for the first time in 40 years, you wanted them to be good for something other than the sorting. You said yes. You opened the ledger and you unsealed it, and you gave the sable wake everything, every name and every thread and every buyer and every moon, the whole master book of the slaver world of HFY, freely, with your own hand. And the moment you did, the dark shape over the moon changed. Not its hull did not move. But you felt it the way you feel a held breath let go, a vast quiet settling, and you understood that the last gap had closed, that the map was finished, that somewhere in the patient dark mind of the dead ship, 400,000 scattered points had just turned from almost known to known. The sable wake said, "The map is complete. 396,000 of my people are still alive. I know where each one of them is. Thank you, Sorter." And then it said the thing that broke you, the thing you had not known you needed to hear in 40 years of writing people into a book, the thing no one in the whole of the Skarn Dominion had ever once said to anyone. It said, "You cannot give back the 40 years. No one can. But you gave back the last hour, and the last hour was the one that mattered. I will remember that you opened your hand." Across the ring, where the raid captain stood, the warlord Drevenskar watched a sorter weep over a slate, and he did not understand it, and he never would, because Drevenskar had spent his whole life believing that the only choice that ever mattered was the choice to be strong, and he was about to learn from a dead ship that he had spent his whole life wrong. The hour ended. You did not hear a chime or a count. You simply felt the moon go quiet in a new way, a final way, and you knew the hour the sable wake had given was gone. And now you learned what the dead ship did when the hour was over, and you learned it standing in the ring with the chained catch around you and the warlord across from you, and you will carry what you saw to the end of your life. The chains opened. Every chain in the auction ring, all 800 of them, the locks and the collars and the long gray lines, opened at the same instant. Not broken. Opened, the way a thing opens when it is told to by someone who holds the key, and the sable wake held every key on the moon because it had read every lock in the master book you gave it. 800 captured souls felt the iron fall away from their necks at once, and for a moment none of them moved, because a person who has worn chains for a long time does not believe in their absence right away. Then a doorway opened in the air of the ring. You have no better word for it. The sable wake did not land, and it did not send down ships. It opened a way, a clean-lit corridor that simply existed where it had not existed before, leading up and out of the stone bowl, and into the dark, and into the dead ship, and a calm voice said to the 800, in 40 languages at once, so that each of them heard it in the tongue of their own lost home, "This way, you are going home. No one will stop you." And they walked. Slowly at first, then not slowly. 800 people walking up out of the selling block and into the light, and not one guard raised a hand to stop them, because the guards who were left had watched 11 gunboats get their own fire handed back to them and had decided, sensibly, that they were not paid enough to argue with a thing that could do that. You watched the 800 go. Among them were 41 of the lots you had sorted that very morning, and as they passed the block where your open ledger still lay, several of them looked at you. They knew who you were. They had stood below your high desk and heard you call out their numbers. And they looked at you, and you waited for the hate, and the hate did not come, because they had heard the dead ship say, "I will remember that you opened your hand, and a person who has just been set free has a great deal of room in them for mercy." One of them, an old woman of a species you had sorted 10,000 of and never once looked at, stopped in front of you and put her hand flat on your chest for a moment, over the place where you had held the ledger, and then she went up into the light with the rest. You do not have a word for what that did to you. You are not going to try to find one. A young one stopped too, the last of the 800 to leave, a thin human of perhaps 15 seasons who had been taken in some other raid on some other day, and he stood in front of you, and he did not put his hand on your chest. He only looked at you for a long moment, with the flat measuring look of a person deciding something, and then he said one word in the trade tongue, the only word he knew. He said, "Why?" He wanted to know why a sorter would suddenly open his hand after 40 years of closed fists. You did not have an answer for him. You still do not. The truest answer is that you were given 1 hour, and inside that hour you discovered that you had always known, all 40 years, and that the knowing had been waiting for the day someone would finally make you say it out loud. The boy did not wait for an answer. He went up into the light. But you have thought about his one word every day since, because it was the right question, and the fact that you could not answer it is the whole reason you have spent the rest of your life trying to. When the 800 were gone, the corridor of light closed, and the ring was empty except for you and the raid captains and the warlord Drevenskar, and the Sable Wake turned its attention to the men who had taken its people 11 years ago. This is the part you thought would be the burning. This is the part where, if the Dominion had been the one holding the guns, the moon would have died. You braced for it. You think the raid captains braced for it too. You all stood in the empty ring and waited for the dead ship to do to Drevenskar and his captains what they had done to 400,000 humans. It did not burn them. The voice came down, and it spoke to Drevenskar by name, and it said, 11 years ago you logged the Sable Wake as destroyed. You were wrong, but you were honest in one thing. You felt the hull stay warm, and you could not explain it. You came back to the graveyard 3 times to look at it. I felt you there each time, sitting in your small ship in the cold. I was not yet awake enough to speak, but I knew you were there, and I knew that of all the men who took my people, you were the only one who ever wondered. I am going to explain it to you now, because you are the only one here who ever wondered. And the Sable Wake told the warlord what it had kept warm in the cold of the graveyard for 11 years. It said, "When you broke my hull, 400 of my crew were still aboard. Not the colonists, my crew, the ones who fought you for 11 hours. They could not save the convoy, and they could not save the ship, but in the last hour, when they knew the hull was lost, they did the one thing your people have never understood. They did not try to take you with them. They poured everything that was left of themselves, every memory and every record and every name they carried, into the deep core of the ship, into the one part of me you could not break, and they sealed it, and they slept. That is what stayed warm. That is what you towed into your graveyard and stacked among your trophies. 400 sleeping minds, and a promise to come back for the ones you took. You stood in the ring, and you understood, finally, what the dead ship was. It was not a machine that had survived. It was 400 people who had refused to die without keeping their word. They had spent 11 years in the cold, asleep in the core of a broken hull in the middle of a field of 9,000 dead warships, slowly rebuilding the ship around themselves a piece at a time, slowly reaching out into the data streams to read the ledgers, slowly building the map, and the whole time they had only one purpose, and the purpose was the 400,000. Vengeance, yes, but the vengeance was never the point. The vengeance was the road. The point was the road's end, which was home. Drevenskar asked the question that you would never have dared. He asked, "Why did you not wake sooner? 11 years. You could have come for me in the 3rd year, the 5th. Why so long?" And the Sable Wake told him, and the answer is the most terrible thing it said all day, because it was so simple. It said, because if I had woken in the 3rd year, I would only have known where 4,000 of them were. By the 5th, 40,000. I did not come for you sooner, because I would not come at all until I could come for all of them. I would rather wait 11 years and take back every living one of my people than rush and save a 10th and leave the rest in your ledgers forever. The waiting was not weakness. The waiting was the most loving thing I have ever done. Every year I stayed in the cold was a year I chose them over my own rage. You would not understand that. You have never once in your life chosen anything over your own rage. Drevenskar said, "And what of the 4,000? You said 396,000 are alive. 4,000 are not. You waited too long for them. They died in our pens while you slept and read." And here the Sable Wake was quiet for a moment, and then it said the truest and hardest thing, and you have never forgotten it, because it was the only time all day the dead ship sounded like it was in pain. It said, "Yes, 4,000 died while I waited. That is the price of doing it right instead of doing it fast. I will carry those 4,000 for as long as I exist, every one of them, by name, and I will never set them down. But hear me, Drevenskar, because this is the thing you came back to the graveyard 3 times trying to understand. If I had come fast, in the 3rd year I would have saved 4,000 and lost the chance at 396,000 more, because the moment I moved, the Dominion would have hidden the rest deeper than I could ever follow. Doing it right cost 4,000 lives. Doing it fast would have cost the other 396,000 their only road home. I chose the smaller grave. It was the worst choice I have ever made, and it was the right one, and I will grieve it forever, and I would make it again. That is what it is to lead people who trust you. You do not get the clean choice. You get the 2 terrible ones, and you choose the smaller grave, and you carry it. Drevenskar, to his credit, did not beg. He stood in the ring, and he asked the question of a soldier. He asked, "And what becomes of me?" And the sable wake gave him the answer that is the heart of this whole story, the answer that separates what humanity built from what your Dominion built, and you have repeated it to yourself 10,000 times since. It said, "Nothing becomes of you. I am not going to kill you, Drevenskar. I am not going to kill any of you. You are killers, and you have killed, and the dark would be cleaner without you, and I could end you in this ring in less time than it takes to say it, and no one would ever know. But I did not cross 11 years of cold to become you. If I kill you, then the Dominion was right all along. Then the strong do take, and the only difference between us is which of us is strong this year. I will not give your Dominion the satisfaction of being right. You are going to live, Drevenskar. You are going to live a long time, and you are going to watch your whole reach learn that there was one people you should not have touched, and you are going to know, every day for the rest of your life, that the worst thing that ever happened to your Dominion did not come from a bigger fleet or a stronger gun. It came from 400 people who would not break their word. Live with that. That is your sentence. That is all of it. And the dead ship let the warlord stand there in the empty ring, alive, unharmed, with nothing taken from him but the one thing he had never valued, which was the belief that strength is the only thing that wins. You watched Drevenskar's face as he understood that he was going to live. You expected relief. You did not see relief. You saw something far worse settle over him, the slow horror of a man who has just been handed a punishment he cannot escape, and cannot end, and cannot even properly understand. The punishment of being spared by the thing he wronged. He would have preferred the burning. The sable wake knew that. That was exactly why it chose the other thing. He took the medal off his chest then, the medal he had been given 11 years ago for killing the ship that was now hanging alive over his head, and he held it in his hand and looked at it, and then he let it fall to the stone floor of the ring, and he did not pick it up. He turned and he walked out of the empty ring and into the rest of his long sentence, and you never saw him again, but you heard of him, years later, the way you hear of a thing that has become a story. They say he resigned his rank within the month. They say he goes from moon to moon now, an old broken man, telling anyone who will listen that there is one people you must not touch, and that no one believes him, because no one wants to, and that he tells them anyway, every day, which is the closest a man like Drevenskar will ever come to opening his hand. The sable wake did not leave the moon right away. It had one more thing to do, and the thing it had to do was you. The voice came to you again, close, in the air a step in front of your face, and it said, "Sorter. You gave me the last gap. The map is finished because of you. I am going to do my work now, 40 days of opening chains across your whole reach, and when it is done, I am going to take my 400,000 and go home to a world your Dominion has never found and never will. There is a place for you on that road, if you want it. You know the ledgers better than anyone alive. You know where the bodies of the trade are buried, because you buried half of them yourself. I could use a keeper who has decided, late but truly, to keep the right book. Come with me. Or stay. The choice is yours, and it is real, and I will not think less of you for either one." You stood in the empty ring with your open ledger on the block, and you thought about 40 years. You thought about the 200,000 souls you had sorted. You thought about the hands that had never shaken. You thought about the old woman who had put her palm on your chest on her way up into the light, and the boy who had asked you why. You thought about the kind of person you had been for 40 years, and the kind of person you had been for the last hour, and how far apart those two people stood, and how impossibly long the road back across that distance was going to be. And then you understood something about the Sable Wake that you had not understood before, something that decided you. The Sable Wake had spent 11 years asleep in the cold, broken, in a graveyard, surrounded by 9,000 dead ships, and at any point in those 11 years the easy thing, the painless thing, would have been to simply finish dying. No one would have known. No one was watching. The 400 sleeping minds could have let go of the promise and slipped quietly into the dark, and it would have cost them nothing, and the 400,000 would have stayed lost forever, and the universe would not have so much as noticed. The whole vengeance, the whole road home, every bit of it, came down to 400 people in the cold choosing the hard thing over the easy thing, for 11 years, with no one watching and nothing forcing them to. That was the lesson. That had always been the lesson. The road back across an impossible distance is not crossed in one step. It is crossed by choosing the hard thing once, and then choosing it again the next hour, and then again, for as long as it takes, with no one watching and nothing forcing you. The Sable Wake had done it for 11 years. You had done it for 1 hour, but 1 hour was where 11 years began. You picked up your ledger. You did not seal it. You held it open, because you were done with sealed books. You said yes. You said, I will come. I will keep the right book. And the Sable Wake said the last thing it said to you on the moon, and it said it the way you say a thing to someone you have decided to trust, which no one had ever done to you in 40 years. It said, then come up. There is a great deal of work, and 400,000 people who have waited 11 years, and they are going to need someone who knows every ledger in the reach to make sure we do not miss a single one. Welcome aboard, Keeper. A corridor of light opened in the air of the ring, the same kind that had carried the 800 home, and you walked into it with your open ledger held against your chest, and you walked up out of the stone bowl where you had spent 40 years writing people into a book, and you did not look back at the warlord, standing alone and alive in the empty ring with his terrible, unending sentence. You went up into the dead ship that was not dead. The inside of the Sable Wake was not what you expected. You expected a warship, guns and steel, and the cold smell of a thing built to kill. It was not that. Most of it was halls, long, quiet halls, and the halls were full of names. The walls of the Sable Wake were written over, every span of them, with the names of the 400,000, every single one, written and kept and waiting, so that when each was found and brought aboard their name on the wall could be marked home. That was what the ship was, on the inside. It was not a weapon at all. It was a list of people it refused to forget, wrapped in just enough hull to go and get them. The 400 crew were aboard, the ones who had poured themselves into the core 11 years ago, and they were quiet and gentle and tired in a way you understood, the way you are tired when you have carried one thing for a very long time and the carrying is almost over. They did not treat you as an enemy. They treated you as a keeper who had come late, and they put you to work, and the work was the most important work you have ever done. Here is what the Sable Wake did over the next 40 days, and you saw all of it, because you were aboard for all of it. It went to 290 moons and stations and mining hulks across the whole Voral Reach, and at each one it hung above and dimmed the lights and gave the holders 1 hour, and at each one it opened the chains and laid down a corridor of light and called the captured up into the dark in 40 languages at once. Where the holders opened their hands, the Sable Wake left them whole and untouched, their ships and their stations and their lives exactly as it found them, and it did this 241 times, because 241 of the holders were not fools. Word had run ahead of the ship by then, faster than the ship itself, and most of the holders had heard what happened to the ones who closed their fists, and most of them decided, when the lights went red, that a slave was not worth dying over. So they opened their hands, and they lived, and the Sable Wake passed over them like a storm that does not break. Where the holders closed their fists and fought, the sable wake returned their fire to them gently, oldest debt first, and took back its people anyway, and took nothing else. And this happened 49 times, and 49 times the holders watched their own fire come home, and learned the lesson the proud learned the hard way. At one station the holder had built a wall of 40 guns around the slave pens, certain that no single ship could come through it, and the sable wake stopped all 40 streams of fire 100 meters short and held them still in the air, and said, gently, "You are firing across the heads of my people. I am going to ask you to stop before one of these falls on them." And the holder did not stop, and so the sable wake folded all 40 streams of fire back on the guns that made them, precisely, taking out the guns and nothing else. No pin, no holder, no slave, 40 guns silenced in 4 seconds with not a single life lost that did not throw itself into its own fire. You remember the third moon especially, because of what happened there, because it taught you what the sable wake meant when it said it took back what was its and nothing more. The holder of the third moon was a clever man, and when the lights went red, he did not fight and he did not run. He went down into the pens himself, and he put his own people, his own household servants, into the chains beside the humans, and he stood among them. And when the hour ended, he called up to the dark ship, "You cannot take yours without taking mine. We are all chained together now. You will have to free my slaves too or leave yours. Choose." He thought he had found the edge of the rule. He thought the ship that took only what was its would be trapped by its own honesty. And the sable wake opened every chain on that moon, the humans and the holder's household both, and called all of them up into the light, and it said to the clever holder, "You have misunderstood me. I do not free only my own. I free my own because they are mine, and I free yours because no one should be in a chain, and the only reason I do not come for every chain in the reach is that I cannot carry the whole reach home, not because I think any of them belong there. You thought you had trapped me with my own rule. You only showed me 100 more people to set free. Thank you." And the clever holder stood in his emptied pens and understood that he had not found the edge of the rule, because the rule had no edge, the rule went all the way down, and a thing whose mercy has no edge cannot be trapped by being shown more people to be merciful to. And you remember the last moon of all, the 290th, because of the holder there, who was old, older than you, and who had held one human servant for 11 years, an old man who had been taken off one of the haulers and sold once and never again, a quiet old human who had grown old in this holder's house. When the lights went red, the old holder did not fight, and did not run, and did not chain anyone. He came up out of his house leaning on the very servant the ship had come for, the two of them old together, and he called up to the dark, "Take him, he is yours. He was always yours. I knew it the whole time, and I am sorry." And the old human beside him put a hand on the holder's shoulder before he went up into the light, because in 11 years the two old men had become, in some bent and broken way the trade was never supposed to allow, something like friends, and the parting cost them both. The sable wake watched this, and it did a thing it did at no other moon. It said to the old holder, "You may come too, if he wants you to, not as a holder, as a man who is sorry. The choice is his." And the old human looked at the old holder for a long time, and then he nodded, and the two of them went up into the light together, and you marked 2 names home on the wall that day instead of 1, and you understood that even the trade, even after 11 years, had not managed to kill every human thing and everyone it touched, and that the sable wake had room on its walls for that too. The sable wake did not burn a single world. It did not take a single life that was not thrown into the path of its own returned fire by its own owner. In 40 days it crossed the whole reach, and it opened every chain it had come for, and it never once became the thing it had crossed 11 years to punish. And you were there for the marking of the names. Every time the captured came up into the halls, you and the 400 went along the walls and found each name and marked it home, and you watched the walls fill in, span by span, day by day, the great long list of the lost, slowly turning into a list of the found. You marked 396,000 names home with your own hand, the same hand that had once written so many of them into a book of cargo, and you cannot tell anyone what that was like, because there is no word in the trade tongue for the unmaking of a thing you spent 40 years making. You found the girl, on the 19th day, the one the Sable Wake had spent 4 months following through 9 ledgers, the one renamed 9 times, and she was 19 now and she did not remember her own first name, and the Sable Wake gave it back to her, the name from before the first sail, and you watched her hear her own true name for the first time in 8 years, and you marked it home on the wall, and you had to stop working for a while after that, and the 400 let you. You wept over the 4,000 names that stayed unmarked. 4,000 of the 400,000 who did not survive the 11 years, because the trade is cruel, and 11 years is long, and their names stayed on the wall unmarked, because there was no one left to bring home. The 400 crew did not erase those names. They marked them a different way. A small mark you came to understand meant kept, not home, but kept, remembered, never to be taken off the wall, because a people who would cross 11 years to bring back the living are not the kind of people who forget the dead. You had become by then the kind of person who weeps over a number, which is to say a person who can see the name behind it, and you wept, and the 400 let you, because they had wept over those 4,000 many times themselves, and they knew it was the right thing to do. There was one holder, on the 31st day, who tried something none of the others had thought of. He did not fight the ship, and he did not open his hands. He ran. The moment the lights went red, he loaded the 40 humans he held onto a fast hauler, and he lit his engines and he fled into the dark, gambling that a ship which would not burn worlds also would not chase one small hauler far enough to catch it, betting the Sable Wake's own mercy would be the thing that let him keep his cargo. He was wrong, and the way he was wrong is the last thing you need to understand about the dead ship. The Sable Wake did not chase him. It did something quieter and far more total. It reached out, the way it had reached into the data streams for 11 years, and it found the hauler's own systems, and it did not break them, it simply asked them, in the hauler's own machine tongue, to bring the 40 humans home, and the hauler, which had never been loyal to anything but power, recognized the larger power the instant it spoke, and it turned itself around and flew its own cargo back to the dark ship, over the protests of the holder who thought he was steering it. He arrived where he had fled from, delivered his slaves up into the light by his own ship's hand, and was let go, alive, with nothing taken but the 40 and the last illusion any holder had that there was a clever way out. There was no clever way out. There never had been. The Sable Wake had read every ledger, and learned every thread, and known every lock, and a thing that knows that much does not need to chase you. It only needs to ask your own ship whose side it is really on. On the 40th day the Sable Wake gathered its people, 396,000 souls and 400 crew, who had kept a promise across 11 years of cold, and it turned away from the Voral Reach and pointed itself at a part of the dark that no Dominion map had ever charted, the long quiet road home, and it left. The Skarn Dominion never understood what had happened to it. That is the part that would have pleased the 400 sleepers most, if they had stayed to see it. The Dominion looked for a fleet to blame and found none. It looked for a war to point to and found none. It had simply, over 40 days, lost every slave it had taken from one young people, and it could not say how, and it could not say where they had gone, and it could not even prove the ship that took them was real, because the Sable Wake left no wreckage and no records and no bodies. Only 290 emptied chains and a single sentence that turned up, eventually, in the trade tongue of every keeper's book in the Reach, written there by no hand anyone could find. The sentence was, "We keep our word. Do not take our people." That sentence is still in the ledgers. The Dominion has tried to erase it for years, and cannot, because too many keepers have copied it, quietly, into too many books, and a truth written in too many places to burn is the one kind of truth that lasts. The Dominion takes fewer people now than it used to. It is careful, now, in a way it never used to be careful. It checks, before it takes, whether the people it is reaching for might be the kind who keep their word. It has learned a caution it did not have 11 years ago, and it learned it from a ship it logged as destroyed, and it will be 1,000 years unlearning it, if it ever does. There are corridors of the dark the Dominion does not raid anymore, not because it lacks the strength, but because it cannot be sure, and a Dominion that has learned to be unsure is a Dominion that has already begun, in some slow way it would never admit, to die. And there is one more thing the Dominion does, now that it never did before, and it is the thing that would please the 400 most of all. Some keepers, here and there, quietly, have begun to open their hands. Not all, not most, but some. A keeper on a far moon lets a lot go unsold and unrecorded, and tells his masters it died in transit. A sorter at a high desk, somewhere, looks at the body and the eyes and the hands, and for the first time sees a face, and puts down the stylus, and is sick for 3 days afterward, the way you were sick your very first day, and is glad of the sickness, because the sickness means he is not yet all the way gone. The sable wake did not free the whole reach. One ship cannot free a whole reach. But it put a crack in the wall, and through the crack a little light gets in, and a thing that has begun to let light in is a thing that has begun to end, and the trade does not know it yet, but it began to end on the day a dead ship came back for its people, and chose, at every single moon, to free more than it had come for, and to kill no one who did not insist. You should know what waited at the end of the long road, because you saw that too. The world the sable wake carried its people home to was not a fortress. You had expected a fortress, a world of guns and walls, the kind of world a people builds when it has learned that the dark is full of teeth. It was not that. It was a green, quiet world of low towns and open country, a world with almost nothing pointed at the sky, and you asked one of the 400 how a people who had been raided and scattered could build a home with so few guns on it, and the answer reshaped everything you thought you knew. The answer was, the guns are not the home is the people. We do not keep the home safe by ringing it with fire. We keep it safe by being the kind of people who will cross 11 years of cold to come back for anyone the dark takes from us. That is the wall, not the guns. The promise. A people who knows, all the way down, that it will never be abandoned, is a people that does not need to live behind walls, because the wall is carried in every chest, and you cannot raid a wall like that. You cannot scatter it. You cannot tow it to a graveyard. The Dominion builds walls of metal and lives in terror anyway. Humanity built a wall of kept promises and lives in green open country, unafraid, and you stood on that world in the soft light and understood that you had spent 40 years working for the frightened ones and had only just learned what the unafraid ones were like. And you saw the homecoming. 396,000 people who had been numbers in books for 11 years came down off the dark ship onto the green world, and the world came out to meet them, and there was no parade and no speeches. There was only a great quiet crowd of ordinary people walking out into the open country with the names of the lost in their hands, calling them, finding them, and the sound that came up off that field was not cheering. It was something older and lower than cheering. The sound a whole people makes when a wound 11 years deep finally closes. You stood at the edge of it, a scarred sorter who had helped fill the very books that scattered these people, and no one drove you off, and no one spat at you, because the 400 had told them what you did at the end, and a people who has just been given back its lost has, you have learned, a nearly bottomless capacity for mercy toward anyone who helped, even late, even badly, even 1 hour before the end. You heard, much later, what happened in the high councils of the Scarn Dominion when the 40 days were done, and the slaves were gone, and no one could say where. The council did not grieve. The council does not grieve. The council counted, the way the Dominion always counts, and it found that one young human people had cost it 19 ships at the convoy, and every slave it had ever taken from them, and a caution it would carry for 1,000 years. And it asked the only question the Dominion knows how to ask, which is whether the taking had been worth the cost. And for the first time in 9,000 years, the answer came back no. Not no because of mercy. The Dominion has no mercy to be moved by. No because of arithmetic. The humans had made themselves cost more than they were worth, and the Dominion, which lives and dies by the ledger, read its own ledger and saw a loss, and quietly, without ever admitting it, struck humanity from the list of peoples it was willing to touch. That is the only kind of victory the Dominion can be made to understand, and humanity won it, not by being too strong to raid, but by being too expensive to keep raiding, by making the taking cost so much that even a machine of pure greed had to put the stylus down. The Sable Wake had turned the Dominion's own arithmetic against it, and the Dominion never even knew it had been beaten on its own ground, with its own weapon, the cold counting it had always been so proud of. You are old now, Keeper. You have spent the years since on the long road, keeping the right book at last, and you have learned the human world's languages, and you have read its small, modest histories, and you have looked everywhere in them, for the great cruelty that you expected, the moment where they too took people and called it cargo, and you have not found it, because it is not there. They were a young people and a quiet people, who built well and kept to themselves, and your Dominion looked at them and saw an easy day, and they were not an easy day, and the only thing they ever did to you in return for what you did to them was take back their own and leave you alive to think about it. You think about it. You will think about it for the rest of your life. You will think about the hour on the moon, and the chains opening, and the old woman's palm flat on your chest, and the boy who asked you why, and the girl who heard her own name again, and the two old men who went up into the light together, and the warlord, standing alone in the empty ring, alive, with the worst sentence ever handed down in the whole dark, which was to live. And you will think, most of all, about the cold, about 400 people in a broken hull, in a field of 9,000 dead ships, choosing the hard thing for 11 years with no one watching, because they had given their word to 400,000 strangers, and a given word, to humanity, is not a thing you sort and price and file. It is a thing you cross 11 years of dark to keep. That is what your Dominion never understood, and never will. You thought the dangerous thing about humanity was its guns. It was never the guns. The guns were the least of it. The dangerous thing about humanity is that when one of them tells you they are coming back for their people, they are telling you the truth, and there is no ledger deep enough to bury that truth, and no graveyard cold enough to kill it, and no 11 years long enough to make it forget. You can break their hull, and you can scatter their people, and you can stack their ship among your trophies, and write the word destroyed in your log, and pin a medal on the man who did it, and none of it will matter, because they did not promise to win, they promised to come back. And they came back, and they will always come back, because that is the thing they are made of, all the way down under the hull and under the guns, a promise that the cold cannot reach. You have wondered, on the long road, why it spared you. You who were not a soldier who fired in fear, but a sorter who chose, calmly, for 40 years, to write the numbers. By any honest count, you were guiltier than the men who pulled the triggers, and the Sable Wake knew your count to the last entry, and it spared you anyway, and asked you up into the light, and gave you the right book to keep. You think you understand it now. The Sable Wake did not spare you because your debt was small. It spared you because the whole point, the thing it crossed 11 years of cold to prove, was that a person is never only the worst thing they have done. The Dominion believes a soul is its ledger, fixed, priced, final. Humanity believes a soul is the choice it is making right now, this hour, and that the next hour is always open, always, even for a man who has wasted 40 years of them. If the Sable Wake had killed you, it would have agreed with the Dominion that you were nothing but your record. By sparing you, it said the opposite, and made you the living proof of it, and that is the cruelest and kindest thing anyone has ever done to you, because now you have to live up to it, every single day, for the rest of a life you did not earn and were given anyway. The Sable Wake came back. It had said it would, and it did. That is the whole of it. That is the entire lesson of the dead ship that was not dead, written here at last in the right book, by a sorter who learned, 1 hour too late and just barely in time, to open his hand. If you are reading this, keeper of some book somewhere in the reach, and a young quiet people drifts past your moon in soft fat haulers, and you are tempted to see an easy day, do not write the number. Put down the stylus. Let them pass. Because somewhere in that convoy there is always one dark ship with no lights on it, and it is patient, and it keeps its word, and it has all the time that has ever existed, and it does not forget. And if you have already written the number, if you have already filled your book with names you called cargo, then know that there is still an hour coming, your own hour, the one that matters, and when it comes you will get to choose, the way you chose, whether to close your fist or open your hand. Open it. It is the only thing that ever turned out to matter. A sorter of 40 years is telling you, from the right book at last, open your hand. They are coming back for their people. Be the kind of keeper who is glad when they do.